Hi, I'm Spencer Christian. On this episode of Tracks Ahead, ride a historic Japanese steam train that has been lovingly restored. We'll visit a man who has realized his childhood dream and meet a dentist who has taken his passion for trains into the backyard. Through the hills of Ohio runs a railroad, 10 railroads actually, under the umbrella of an organization called the Ohio Central Railroad System. Holding the umbrella is an entrepreneur who fell in love with trains as a young boy. He loved the Lionel that circled around the Christmas tree as much as he loved the big black steam engines that thundered down the tracks near his home. Years later, that love would become his life.
The Ohio Central Railroad System is a network of 10 commonly managed and operated short-line railroads cruising along hundreds of miles of track throughout Ohio and Pennsylvania. Some of the lines had been abandoned, or were soon to be, when they were brought to life once again beginning back in the 1980s. And success looks good on the Ohio Central. There is steam and there is diesel. There is old and there is new. She hauls everything from coal and metal to lumber and corn syrup. It is a well-managed and modern freight railroad that has become an important part of the economic backbone of this part of the country. In an industry that once struggled, it is a business model that has found its niche and now thrives.
The railroad has found that it is not unusual to provide service to customers who are more than willing to pay for it. What we've been able to do is focus on the level of service, dedicated service, and employ a group of people who are extremely energized and understand the value of the service that they provide. In the nature of our railroads, they're all regionally located. We would like the areas to think of them as their own hometown railroad. That gives us an identity factor that we use to market. We empower all of our employees, our supervisors, our managers, our hourly folks, to make the decisions that are needed to be made every day so they can best run their railroad. They do not need to come back to corporate for other than support. The biggest challenge is to try to take an industry that has a reputation that may not be most favorable and let the customer or prospective customer know that you have changed. Many times we do that by challenging, by explaining that if we're given an opportunity, we can quickly prove or disprove if we have changed to become better in the service field. Customers were willing to take that chance, and we were able to demonstrate that we, in fact, were a much different industry as a short line.
Command Central for the Ohio Central Southern Line is here in Coshocton, Ohio, where 10 railroads carrying tens of thousands of carloads of freight each year are meticulously managed, scheduled, and maintained. Used here is a cutting-edge, modern, high-tech computerized control system called Train Sentinel, manufactured by Quantum. It drastically cuts down on the amount of time needed to perform various tasks and nearly eliminates any possibility of human error. It is 21st century railroading.
Previous to purchasing the Quantum system, we did everything by hand. Everything was handwritten on blocked papers, and we dispatched the entire railroad system, which we were dispatching about 280 miles of system without the aid of a computer. Basically, it was all done the old-fashioned way. So we purchased this Quantum system earlier this year, and that allows us to put everything on computer, and it takes most of the human error out of it. A train will call in and request a segment of track, and each one of these little things is a segment, and tell us how many segments or what direction he wants to go, and we will issue these tracks via the computer to him. The system knows where the train is right now by them telling us where they are, but eventually, which is new and not been used in the rail industry before, it will know by GPS satellite where the train is and actually control the train. What has never been done before is they've tracked trains like many other things, ships and everything else, with satellite. We are going to track these trains by satellite, both the front and the rear portion of the train, and then we are going to connect these computers to the air brake system, the locomotive, and we can actually control the train from here.
But running a railroad operation like this is not all high-tech. Increasing the size of a tunnel to accommodate new, larger coal cars requires a good deal of earth moving. There is an astronomical amount of manual labor involved, seen here at the Morgan Run shops, where different things are renewed, refurbished, built from scratch, and even created. And it's not all modern either. The beautiful old bridges in Zanesville still lift and swing the same way they did decades ago, when the town was growing up, just like the railroad industry was. It's things like this that are constant reminders of our history. The railroad also maintains an impressive collection of vintage steam and diesel locomotives. Some are museum-quality pieces which give passers-by a chance to see railroad history up close.
We started the steam program the same year that the Ohio Central started. That was 1988. We finished the restoration of the one locomotive, the 1551, and put it in service in November of that year for some test drives. And then in the spring of 1989, we started our little one-hour trips on a daily basis between May and October in Sugar Creek, Ohio. And from then on, it just kind of kept blossoming. That was our first engine on the property, and the owner enjoys steam, and that was the main reason why he actually purchased the Ohio Central. His vision was we'll move freight, but what a wonderful place through the Amish country that we could run steam locomotives and pull, passenger trains on these little one-hour trips. So that was the deciding factor to continue to grow with more cars and more locomotives.
Owner Jerry Joe Jacobson built this company piece by piece. His love of trains began long before his name was ever on the masthead. From the trains that rolled on the tracks outside of his Indiana home to the model trains that rolled around his Christmas tree as a young boy, Jacobson has always felt the pull. And back in 1957, when at the age of 14, he was given a ride on a B&O steam locomotive pulling a freight train through Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, Jerry fell in love. It was that moment that gave birth to the dream that became the Ohio Central.
And that's a shame because young kids now don't get the thrill or sight of a steam locomotive. They just have to see one at an amusement park or in a museum somewhere, and that's all that's left. So we're still running ours around town here in Coshocton on the Ohio Central. We enjoy it very much, and I'm sure it surprised a lot of people to see an old steam engine still running, And it's a fun thing to come to. It's a great thing for grandchildren, especially the little boys, This is the Barbie doll for the little boys, the big steam locomotive, the real thing. The sight, the smell, the sound, that's the great stuff. The heat off the boiler, the sound of the whistle and everything else, that's all one big package of enjoyment and thrill.
The future for the Ohio Central is bright, I believe, as the people that have made this company what it is today, and that is virtually everybody. We have an ethanol plant under construction. It is due to come online in October. We are now employing technology that short lines would not have thought of using, such as positive train control, satellite technology. We have expanded our system from one railroad to 10, and today we operate just under 600 miles. And we have approximately 95 locomotives to service those customers.
It's probably safe to say that one reason Jerry Joe Jacobson and the Ohio Central have been so successful is because they are able to provide customers with exactly what they want and exactly what they need. Another reason has got to be that Jerry Joe Jacobson and his employees obviously love railroading and everything about it, both old and new.
Jerry Joe Jacobson continues to find some of his locomotives in odd places, including the online auction site eBay. Sometimes a dream starts when we're young, and if we're fortunate, we can realize that dream at some point in our lives. That's what happened to John Schoenenberg.
Suppose that it's 1950, and the Milwaukee Road and the Chicago Northwestern Railroads have merged. Now suppose that they run their colorful passenger trains through the rolling hills and farmland of southwestern Wisconsin. Sound like a fantasy? Perhaps, but it's fact on the N-Gauge Chicago, Milwaukee, and Northwestern Railroad of John Schoenenberg. The result of over 25 years of planning and construction. It started back in 1947 in tiny New Glarus, Wisconsin.
When I was 4.5 years old, my grandparents, who lived in New Glarus, Wisconsin, gave me an American Flyer train set. My uncle purchased it at the New Glarus hardware store. When I opened that train, I was elated. It was the most wonderful gift I'd ever received. My father and I set it up and we ran it around the Christmas tree, and we ran it several times a year. He was quite protective of the train set, knew it was kind of a valuable toy, and so we didn't run it too often.
About the time John was 14, he and a friend discovered a book that would prove to be instrumental in his love of model railroading.
When I was about 14 years old, I met a friend on a school bus going to high school. His name was Jay Corey, and he and I were both interested in model railroading. And he recommended a book written by Frank Ellison. It was a book that was published in 1954. It was just 154 pages, but it explained everything that you needed to know to build and operate a model railroad. I decided that I would use the tools and the methods that Frank Ellison illustrated in his book. So I built the mountains and the scenery out of wire screen and plaster. I scratch built some buildings. I remember building a meat packing plant, an oil depot, refrigeration ice plant, and a power plant.
But as a young student, John didn't have the time or the place to do much more than continue to scratch build structures. And a chance passing of a hobby shop in the late 1960s introduced him to N-Gauge.
I was an intern in dentistry in Buffalo, New York, and I was walking down the street one day and I passed a hobby shop, and there was an N-scale set in the window. It was a very beautiful Pennsylvania E8 with 4 Rivarossi heavyweight passenger cars. I lived in apartments for many years early on, and there isn't a lot of room in an apartment, so I decided on N-scale.
John had a dream to someday continue that layout he had as a child. And in 1976, that opportunity finally presented itself, and he modeled what he remembered.
Well, most of my life I've lived in this area. I lived most of my years in Milwaukee, but I've lived in Fond du Lac, spent time in New Glarus, Wisconsin, and so I remember this area from my childhood days.
John started building his scenery using plaster-soaked paper towels and progressed through styrofoam and plaster cloth. But the scenery isn't the only thing that's hand-built on this layout. His buildings are also specially constructed.
I take kits, building kits, and maybe 2 or 3 of the same kit or varying kits, and I kit bash those into buildings that fit the space that I have and that I require to have buildings in.
Structures aren't the only things that are kit bashed. John does rolling stock as well.
This is my workshop where I build all of the rolling stock for my railroad, especially the passenger cars. Here I'm going to be fabricating a Milwaukee Road 10-6 sleeper. I purchased the car sides from a manufacturer in Canada, and then I use an American Limited core kit, which supplies the roof and the underbody details and the ends. And from that I build up the passenger car, put on the proper trucks.
Using a digital command control system is a far cry from that first layout. And it allows John the opportunity to escape from the ordinary into a very rewarding world.
Well, when I'm working on the layout, everything, all my concerns and all of my worries and everything leaves. I'm totally at peace when I'm working on my layout. It involves carpentry, it involves artistic work, it involves scratch building, it involves electrical work, electronics. It's all very, very enjoyable.
The Chicago, Milwaukee, and Northwestern Railroad really started over half a century ago, and it lives on as a tribute to the ambitions and craftsmanship of John Schoenenberg, who started with a train under a tree in a small town in Wisconsin.
John continues to add scenery and continually looks for new areas to model. In a moment, we'll travel into beautiful Ontario, Canada, where we'll visit one of the most interesting dentists you've ever met. He loves trains so much he models them. And we're not talking about something that runs around the Christmas tree. We're talking about trains so big you can climb on board as they pull you into another world. But first, mention rail travel in Japan, and most people will think of the sleek bullet trains. However, steam railroading still thrives in Japan. Let's visit a line that was brought back into service by public demand.
To most Westerners, travel in Japan means rail travel. Courtesy of Japan Airlines and the National Tourist Organization, Tracks Ahead visited Yamaguchi, where we stepped into the past. Traveling in Japan by rail wouldn't be complete without riding one of Japan's well-preserved steam engines. By the early 1950s, there were almost 5,000 steam locomotives running through the country. But in the next 2 decades, diesel and electric trains were rapidly replacing them. Fortunately, as steam locomotives began to disappear, there was a growing interest in preserving Japan's railway heritage.
Yamaguchi SL train operation was terminated in 1973. All SLs in Japan were terminated in 1975. The SL Yamaguchi Go restarted in 1979, 6 years after termination. This occurred because of strong requests from rail fans.
The 15 steam operations still running in Japan today are considered to be works of historical and cultural importance. That's why private rail companies, such as JR West, have dedicated funding and resources to housing, maintaining, and operating these trains. The Yamaguchi Go steam operation maintains 2 engines, the C-56 and the C-57. Because of its relatively light weight, the C-56 is called the Pony. The C-57 once hauled the Emperor's train, and she earned a more endearing nickname. Because her elegant lines and proportions made her a favorite, everyone who saw her, workers and passengers alike, referred to her as the Lady. Mr. Toshihiro Mikawa worked on some of these trains while they were still running throughout the country.
When I was employed, the C-57 and the SLs were in the glory of the era. Then they were terminated, and I am not sure when the service was restarted. I was assigned to Oguri, where I first encountered SLs. I started operation in the office, and after recommendations by senior staff, I started running SLs. I liked SLs more and more, and now I love SLs very much. I enjoy looking at the passengers' smiling faces and am proud of the operation.
We join many excited rail fans from all over Japan and the world in waiting to board the beautifully maintained C-57 steam engine at the station in Oguri. The Yamaguchi Go steam line operates a 37-mile stretch from Oguri to Suwano on weekends and many national holidays. Obviously, the children here look upon this ride as a special treat. Our starting point, Oguri, is at the western end of Honshu Island, and it takes almost 6 hours to reach it by bullet train from Tokyo. Once you get to the station, you should make a point to visit all of the 5 passenger cars. Each one is decorated in the style of a different era. Here in the retro Meiji car, soft lighting and dark brown interior colors recreate the era of the late 1800s. In the retro Taisho car, the dropped ceiling, transom windows, and an amber floor are the hallmarks of this romantic period. The retro Showa car shows Japan's thrust into modernization in the middle of the 20th century. In the European car, soft light filters through stained glass windows, and every aspect of the lush interior is designed to make you feel like you're on the Orient Express. Finally, there's an observation parlor car where you can get some of the best views on the train and pretend you've gone back in time. It takes about 2 hours to reach Suwano, so there's plenty of time to relax and enjoy the Japanese countryside. During your 3-hour layover in Suwano, you'll still feel like you're in another era. Bicycles are an easy way to enjoy Suwano's narrow streets and alleys. You can find rental shops outside the train station. Once a castle town, this medieval village still has many well-preserved samurai houses. Its ruling families were proud patrons of the arts, and now travelers can enjoy their efforts. In the hills overlooking Suwano, you'll find a shrine dedicated to harvest and merchants. The Taiko-dani Inari Shrine is one of the 5 major Inari shrines in Japan. Its brilliant red torii, or gates, line the path from the temple to the river. Make sure you visit the historic Tonomaki neighborhood, where you'll see thousands of gold carp, or koi, swimming in the moat. These fish have been bred here since feudal times. There's a saying here that the koi outnumber the residents of Suwano by 7 to 1. The ride back to Oguri on Engine 57 leaves us with memories of dancing koi, brilliant red temples, and a steam engine, the Lady. whose elegant form reminds us that she once served an emperor.
Millions of people around the world who've read the popular comic strip For Better or For Worse are familiar with the character John, a dentist who's also a model railroading fanatic. Artist Lynn Johnston created the character John based in part on her husband, Rod, a dentist who was also a model railroading fanatic. Well, meet Rod Johnston, a very real and very three-dimensional character.
Well, first of all, when you show up, people expect you to be two-dimensional. And they expect when you turn sideways you disappear. That's the first thing. The second thing is, because the comic strip is so well read and because John is such a lovable character, that my impression is made before I speak. And so I have this great impression, and all I have to do is open my mouth and ruin it. So it's kind of neat to have that, where people smile the minute they see you and say, "Oh, I know you." You know. In fact, John is quite different than I am, but it's still fun to be a comic strip character.
Rod Johnston models large-scale trains, which are model trains large enough to be ridden by an adult. He models 1-inch model railroads, or trains that are 1/12 the size of the real thing. It's about 10 inches wide and stands 13 or 14 inches tall.
When I grew up in Lynn Lake, which was a little mining town of 1,200 people, there was no one around. We were out in the middle of the swamp, 800 miles north of Winnipeg, and the only way to Lynn Lake was by train. And so what we would do is every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday night, the whole town would come down and watch the train come in. And at the end of it was a mining town, at the end of the long train with boxcars and gondolas, which were empty, they were hauling the ore out with that. At the end were 2 old heavyweight passenger cars and an orange caboose. And we'd watch to see who got off the train to see what new people were coming to town. And so the next day at school, we'd all talk about who got off the train. And I remember standing on that platform and the whoosh of the air and the sound of the whistle, just as you couldn't see the train as it came around the corner and then marched up and came across the platform. It was always exciting to see that. And so now on my layout, I can lay my head down and watch when the train goes by in 1-inch scale, and it just sends shivers down my spine still.
Rod fell in love with 1-inch the first time he saw it more than 15 years ago. His old Garden Railroad didn't stand a chance. It went up for sale. He now has over a quarter-mile track laid in his North Bay, Ontario backyard. The track winds its way through the 4-acre forest.
The layout started just loosely to be a track through the woods, just like it was in Lynn Lake. And my goal was to build the layout with the train. So I had gondolas, metal gondolas that I purchased from Iron Pony in those days, and 2 GP9s. And I have a little area here where I dump the gravel, and I'd go with my little train down, load up the cars with gravel, and then push it to the end, shovel out the gravel. And once I had 10 feet of roadbed, I'd lay another 10 feet of track down. And so my goal was not to cut any trees down, so the track tends to wind around all the trees. And it goes a quarter of a mile with a loop at the far end. I intended to go further, but I ended up accidentally buying a collection which had some steam engines in it. And you can't run these steam engines backwards. They're very awkward things. So I put a loop in at the far end, and that's where the track is ended at the moment.
In the year 2000, when he found out the Iron Pony Company, the place where he bought his equipment, was going out of business, Rod decided to buy the company. What had been a time-consuming avocation would grow into a second job. He renamed the company Riding Rail Kits, and they now supply others who have the same kind of passion that Rod has. Everything needed to build your own backyard layout.
Nowadays, I would say my average customer is 45 to 50 years old, has a couple of young kids. And really what we've been advertising for and gearing to is for people to put these trains in their backyards. And because it's 1-inch scale, it's the same size as dollhouse size, so you can get all kinds of accessories for this scale. And it's quite wonderful for people to set up whole scenes in their backyards and have their kids out riding on the trains.
Though it's a large toy, you really don't need a giant estate to have a home track. A typical suburban lot will do, and a starter set will probably set you back a few $1,000s. but the feeling you get will be priceless. Model railroads that you can ride and that bring the hobby a little closer to real life. You feel the track, you feel the locomotive, you feel the excitement. But more importantly, you feel the satisfaction this big toy can bring every single time you see someone on board smile.
Rod continues to work on his line and is building another complete setup at a new home in the woods. That's it for this episode. Thanks for being with us, and please join us next time for more Tracks Ahead.